صل وسلم دائما أبدا على حبيبك خير الخلق كلهم يا رب.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The next section is Mawtu walid-un-nabi wa dhikru murdi'atihi. The chapter concerning the death of the Prophet ﷺ's father and his wet nurses. Bayanu mawti walid al-Mukhtari wa kam lahu kana min al-ari. Al-dhi'ru is a wet nurse. They're also called murdi'. For people that are studying Arabic, generally, if it's an unambiguous substantive, in other words, if the noun is clearly male or female, then the Arabs don't need to indicate that it's a female. So they'll just use the male, generally the male form, which shows you that it's not a male form. It's just a way of characterizing it. So you don't say murdi'a because only a woman does wet nursing. You say murdi', or you say hamil for a pregnant woman. You don't say hamila or dhi'r, same like that. So وَمَاتَ عَبْدُ اللَّهِ وَهُوَ حَمْلُ وَكَمْ حَوَتْ مِنْ شَرَفٍ هُذَيْلُ. So he says Abdullah died while the Prophet ﷺ was in utero. So the Prophet was still in his mother's womb when Abdullah died, and he died. He got a fever. He actually they had a very short honeymoon, and then he went to on a trip and died from his fever. And then, وَكَمْ حَوَتْ مِنْ شَرَفٍ هُذَيْلُ, and what honor the clan of Hudayl obtained. لَمَّا غَدَتْ بِنْتُهُمُ السَّعْدِيَّةِ مِنْ أُمَّهَاتِ أَشْرَفَ الْبَرِيَّةِ, as a result of their daughter, the Sa'diyah. So Banu Sa'd is really very close to here, and there's still Sa'di people. There's Banu Sa'd are here. We were just, our driver last night was from Banu Sa'd. So there's still, the tribes are here, and that tribe will be honored as long as there's Muslims, because, and he said, I'm from Halima Sa'diya's tribe. Like, he knows that that's his ancestors' tribe. So that's exactly what he's saying here. How much honor, what honor the clan of Hudayl had because they had this wet nurse. And the story that it's worth telling, there was a drought in this region, and it was a very difficult year. The Banu Sa'd were Bedouin, and the Bedouin were noted first of all for their language. So they had a very high language. It was very pure Arabic, and also the number of words that they used was greater than the words that they used in the city. What you'll note when you get into Arabic, if you ever see the desert Arabs when they relate hadith, they're very different from the other hadiths. They're actually very complicated. Halima Sa'diya's hadith, you need a dictionary. If you look at the hadith that she relates, she uses words that are just not commonly used, but that was their language. So the Quraysh, who were the Ahlullah, they were the people of God, they had a special ontological status, so to speak, amongst the Arabs. They had a special, they saw them as a special type of people, that they were not like other people, and they had leadership responsibilities. So the aristocrats amongst them would send their children to be with the desert Arabs in order for them, for two reasons. They believed that the air was better than in the cities, that it was healthier air. They thought that it was good for the young children so it was a Spartan type belief, like in Greece, the idea of raising your children in Spartan environments so that they would have very strong, what we would say today, immune systems. And then also to learn this pure Arabic. So the Prophet ﷺ, when he was born, they had it was almost like a souk, and the Bedouin women would come in, and the Qurayshite women would sit with their babies, and the Bedouin women would come and make a deal. Which, one of the things you have to marvel is at this trust, the level of trust in the society. So you can imagine, because of the tribal conditions, if people gave their word, it shows you the Arabs, how extraordinary the word was amongst the Arabs. because they're handing over their baby to a complete stranger. But they're not complete strangers in that they know what tribe they're from, and the tribes were people that understood the responsibility of each tribal member. So the Arabs said, "An-nar wal al-ar," we'd rather go to hell than bring shame on our tribe. And that was a very, very strong Arab perspective. So the trust was immense. But the Amina Zuhriya was, at this point, she was in the Hashemite clan, even though she's a Zuhriya, but she was, because her son is a Hashemite from Abdullah, but they were on hard times. And he was considered yatim, because if they lost the father, then the major caregiver, الرجال قوامون على النساء, this was the Arab system that men were the caretakers of women. And so the loss of the father was a major event. Now, obviously, you have the uncle who takes those responsibilities, the grandfather in the case of the Prophet at this time. But when the wet nurses came in, they saw, and they knew, because it was like a gossip thing. They knew who was who and which family was going to, that's a Makhzumi baby, a lot of money there. So that was the kind of, they were hoping to get benefits from the children. Well, Halima relates the hadith and says that all the babies got taken except for the Prophet ﷺ. And she said to her, she didn't find a baby that day, and she said to Abu Kabsha, her husband, I don't want to go back to the desert without anybody, so let's go back and take that orphan. And so she went back. And what's interesting, on the way, her donkey was really wasted. It was a female donkey, Atan, and it was very weak, and she was the last with the women were riding the donkeys, and she was the last because her donkey was so slow. And so she goes, and she comes, and she said the Prophet ﷺ was sleeping on a green blanket, and she could hear his snoring, she said. And she made the deal with Amina, and she took the baby, and she said that right when she took the baby, she could feel the milk in her breasts. She could feel the milk in her breast begin to flow. And because she had another child, she said the Prophet ﷺ would only take from one breast. So then when she gets on her donkey to go back, suddenly the donkey's got all this energy. And she said it was riding ahead of all the other donkeys. And she said, the other women said, Halima, did you get a new donkey in Mecca? She said, no. And they said, well, what happened to your donkey? Where'd it get all that energy? But that's the reality of the Prophet ﷺ, is that everything was aware of, even the stones. Some of the Sahaba had the unveilings, and they heard the stones greeting him. So these are real events, that real human beings that happen to people. But when she gets back that night, when when Abu Kabsha went out to milk the sheep, all udders were full. And he brings in, they said it was the first time that they'd went to bed full for a long time. And he said to her, you've brought a nasama mubarakah. This is a blessed soul you've brought into our house. So they connected. They could see the connection between what was happening. And then when they would send the animals to graze despite the drought, they would come back with their udders full. And so the other Sadis would say to their shepherds, go follow the animals of Abu Kabsha, to see where they're. But it wasn't about the physical It was about the barakah, and that's the secret of barakah, because barakah is where a little something that has a little bit of barakah has the same result of something that there's a lot of. A little with barakah is better than a lot without barakah. So you can eat a little bit of food. If it has barakah, you feel satiated, and you'll get more nutrition from the food. Whereas food that doesn't have barakah, you can eat a lot of it and you don't feel satiated. And it doesn't have the same effect on the body. So لما غدت بنتهم السعدية من أمهات أشرف البرية وكم رأت له من الآيات حليمة منها الدرور الشاتي. So how many clear signs did Halima see from him? Among them was the excessive flow of her sheep's milk, but also her own breast milk. وشق صدر أكرم الأنام وهو ابن عامين وسدس عامي. And the noblest of humanity's chest was split when his age reached 2 years and 2 months. He was playing, and so this would be, he would be walking and probably talking. Some children, precocious children, start talking by that age. They're talking, but he would definitely have been walking. So he was playing with his brothers and sisters in the radha'a, and two angels appeared and they fled. And the angels took and split his chest in the riwayah, and opened it and took the heart and put it in a tas, which is like a bowl that had ice in it. And then they poured over it Zamzam. Now, to me, what's very, very amazing about that hadith is that if anybody's ever seen an open heart surgery, one of the things that they do is they put the heart, or a transplant, they keep the heart on ice, because the ice slows down the metabolic rate of the heart. So, and then they pour over what they call a cryonic solution, which is a very cold water that has a lot of potassium and sodium in it to the electrolytes that are needed for the anabolic catabolic exchange going on. So the description is very similar to the description of a modern day heart surgery. And Sahaba said that if you look closely on the Prophet's chest, you could see a very fine line up his chest from when his chest was split. Now, if you've ever seen people that have had heart surgery, they have that scar from the splitting of. So this was something the Sahaba themselves witnessed. And it's now open heart surgery is a common thing, but in these times to hear that, the idea of having the chest split and the heart taken out and that operation occurring is just something really quite extraordinary. So وَالشُّقَّ لِلْبَعْثِ وَلِلْأَسْرَاءِ أَيْضًا كَمَا قَدْ جَاءَ فِي الْأَنْبَاءِ. And it was also split at the outset of his prophetic mission. He had his heart washed 3 times. And then before the Isra, according to. And all of the prophets had their hearts washed. And the bowl that was used was the same bowl. And it was actually the bowl, according to some narrations, it was in the tabut of the Jews, in the Ark of the Covenant, that they had the bowl in there with the staff of Moses and some of the other relics from the prophets. And then he says, وَكَمْ حَوَتْ ثُوَيْبَةٌ مِّن بَرَكَةٍ لَمَّا غَدَتْ ذِئْرًا لَهُ وَبَرَكَةً. How many blessings Thuwayba gained after becoming a wet nurse, as did Barakah. So these were the women that were in that were, and Thuwayba was the one that was freed for giving the good news. So لما غدت ذئرا له وبركة إن حضنته ثم بعد الأم غدا كفيل الجد ثم العم. So Barakah was his nanny, and then after the death of his mother he entered the guardianship of his grandfather Abdul-Muttalib, and thereafter of his paternal uncle Abu Talib when he died. وخلفته أمه ابن 4 سنين والجد ابن ضعفها فعي. So his mother died and left him when he was just 4 years old, and his grandfather when he was 8. So you should know this. ثم إلى الشام مع العم ارتحل والعمر في ثالثة العشر دخل. He then traveled with his uncle to Syria. After that, after he had entered his 13th year. Now, this also is something to think about, that he's a 13-year-old boy and he's going on a commercial trip with his grandfather. He was the one that wanted to go with his grandfather, with his uncle. Initially, his uncle did not want to take him. His uncle loved him, and his uncle used to sit. Even Abdul had a place at the Kaaba nobody could sit on. It was like this special place because he was Sayyid of the Quraysh. But whenever the Prophet came, he would let him play there, and he was amused by it, and he used to say, "Inna lahu sha'an," he's going to be something great. So his grandfather recognized that, and Abu Talib also loved him immensely. He took him on this trip, and as you know, a lot of you are very familiar with these stories. But when he went, there's a tree that's still there. It's a stunning tree if you've ever seen it, a picture of it. It's an amazing tree. It extends out so far, the shade. But the tree that the tree that he was under when he went on his commercial trip and sat under that tree, that the Nestor, the Nestorian monk that saw him. On this trip, they came to Busra, which is on the border of Syria and Arabia. And Bahira or Buhaira, both riwayat are there, Bahira or Buhaira. Buhaira was the monk. He was probably an Nestorian monk, and he was there he had a dair, like a little monastery. And when he saw the Prophet ﷺ, he recognized certain signs: the tree, the cloud that shaded him, and he knew that there was a prophet coming. And he asked, he made a banquet, and he invited all of these Quraysh. And that was the first time they used to stop there, because it was a place on the road to Syria that they would stop. So they knew he was there, but he never paid them any attention before that. So this time he asked them all to come. And so they came, and when they came, they had left the Prophet ﷺ, because he was the youngest, to take care of the animals with some of the servants. And Buhaira said, where's everybody's not here? And they said, well, we left one boy out. And he said, no, I want everybody. So they brought him. And then Buhaira looked at the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, who's the father? And Abu Talib said, I'm the father. And he said, his father shouldn't be alive. He said, well, I'm the uncle. And this is a proof that the uncle and the father is the same in the Arabic language. So when Arabs say Abu, it can mean Ammuhu. And that's why when Jacob is told that your fathers Ibrahim and Ismail, even though Ismail is not his father, it's his uncle, but he's still called his father in the Quran. So, and also Ibrahim, when he tells his father, who's an idolater, it's actually Azar was his uncle. It wasn't his blood father, because his father was a muwahid. So he says to him, Unshiduka billat wal Uzza, I swear by Lat and Uzza. And he said, Innahuma abghadu unasin ilayya, abghadu asma'in ilayya. Those are the most odious names to me. And because the Prophet did not like the idols from the time he could comprehend. And so then Bahira asked him some questions, and then he asked to see his back. And he looks on his back, and on the back between his two shoulder blades was the seal. And the seal, they were raised flesh. It was a raised flesh in a circle. And it was a reddish. And that was the seal of that was mentioned in the earlier books. So he knew who he was, and he told Abu Talib, don't take him into Palestine, because he's worried about some of the Jews there that would know who he was. And this was a time of immense animosity between Jews and Christians. So you should know that the the treatment of the Jews under the Christians was incredibly harsh. They were not allowed to go into Jerusalem, and they were extremely oppressed minority. So the animosity between these two groups was immense. So he tells them that, and the Prophet ﷺ actually goes back. He did not go past Busra. He goes back. And then he says, فَرَدُّهُ خَوْفًا مِنَ الْيَهُودِ عَلَيْهِ أَهْلَ الْمَكْرِ وَالْجُحُودِ. So his uncle sent him back out of fear of the Yahud, some being devious and disbelieving folk. وعاد مع ميسرة للشام وهو من الرحمن في إكرامي. He later returned to Syria with Maysara, all the while in the bounty of the merciful. So Maysara, who was the servant of Khadija, when he became her agent, commercial agent, and he goes with Maysara. تظله الأملاك في المسير حين اشتداد الحر في الهجير. The angel shaded him during the trip from the worst of the heat at midday. وإذ إلى مكة عاد وافتتح 26 من العمر نكح. When he returned to Mecca at the outset of his 26th year, he entered into marriage. Now, the Prophet ﷺ, he actually tried to marry a woman before that, but could not because of his financial situation. But Khadija, من بعد 40 مضت لها من عمرها سنين. He married Lady Khadija after 40 years of her life had passed by. It was around 40 years. She might have been slightly younger than that, in her late 30s. خير نساء الناس يجمعين وقد أقامت معه 20. The best of women, all of them, she resided with him for 24 years. وأربع مرزق البنين منها سوى أحدهم يقينا. And all of his children he was granted from her except for one with certainty. So that's only one of his children was not from her, Ibrahim from Maria al-Qibtiyya. ثم ابن 35 حضر بناء بيت الله إذ بنى الحجر. When he asked for Khadija's hand, she actually asked for his hand. When Maysara took him on this trip, she had never made as much money as she had when he was her commercial agent. Again, this barakah of the Prophet ﷺ. So he comes back, and then Maysara tells her stories about what happened, like that he saw the cloud covering. Khadija was also aware. Her cousin Waraqa bin Nawfal was somebody who had knowledge of the prophetic signs. He knew the Old and New Testament. And the Hanif people knew that there was a prophet expected. The Ansar knew that there was a prophet expected. So she actually thought that he might be that one. But she asked to marry him. She was very wealthy. She'd been married twice before. One died, and one of the marriages was not a good marriage. But she'd been married twice before. She married the Prophet ﷺ when she was around 40 and he was 25, 26 years of age, which is very interesting because one of the things that happens in marriage generally, when usually men marry women that are younger than they are. I mean, this is kind of the general thing. In the Arab world, so it's not so much in the West. In the West, because of a lot of people meet their mates in school, so they a lot of times you'll find people that are close, similar age, maybe a couple of years difference. But in the Arab world and generally in the pre-modern world, women tended to be 10 to 15 years younger than the men. In fact, we were asking this Bedouin man who was with us yesterday if he was married. I was with Shaykh Abdullah, and he said no. And we said, are you going to get married? And he said, well, I have a philosophy about that. And we said, like, what's that? He said, I'm going to marry when I'm 30, and I'm going to marry the girl when she's around 15 or 16. And we said, why is that? And he said, because when a man's around 42, he needs renewal. And he said, if I marry her, when I'm 42, she'll be at the height of her youth. so I won't need renewal from somewhere else. So that was his. But that's very consistent with this kind of pre-modern view of things, that the men would tend to marry women that were younger than they were. So he had it all worked out, this guy, yesterday. Yeah. And then we said, so do you already have the, oh yeah, he said, and he said, Shaykh Abdullah said, so is she happy about this? Ma عندها كلام. But one of the interesting things about this is that when a woman reaches probably around 30, sometimes it happens a little early, sometimes a little later, but generally a woman begins in the first years of the marriage, and this is for the shabab here, so I'm giving you some good advice. In the first years of marriage, she will often be a lot more tractable than she is later on. And what I mean by that is that she'll tend to not disagree with you, but as she gets older and feels more comfortable in herself, she becomes more self-assertive. Now what happens to a lot of men is that when they see that, they get very threatened by that. And then that's when some real conflicts can start. Now sometimes if a woman has that strong type of personality, that can happen right at the outset, and there's problems at the outset because the men aren't expecting that. But the Prophet ﷺ, because he had already a mature woman who was fully in her, she was not, the Lady Khadija was a very strong lady. She was a independently wealthy woman. She'd hired men, she'd fired men. She had been married before, so she knew what to expect from men. So when the Prophet comes in, he's really the young one. He's the one that has no experience. And that's why her nurturing, the nurturing of Khadija for the Prophet ﷺ is very important. Now when you see the Prophet ﷺ get married to Aisha, who's very young, what you see from Aisha is almost immediately she's coming into her own. And that's because the Prophet ﷺ, he did not in any way suppress that aspect of the women that he was with. He actually encouraged that, for them to be independent, for them to have their own opinions, for them to challenge the opinions of the men they were with, which is very unusual. And that's why the Aisha disagrees with the Prophet. I mean, and you have to, imagine, I mean, this is the Prophet of God, Rasulullah. She believes in that. Her father is the #1 follower of the Prophet, and yet you can see how forthright she is in that. And we have so many intimate details of how he interacted with her. So he married her when she was at that mature age, and then stayed with her until she was into her 60s. So, and she was also a very beautiful woman. She was noted for her beauty. بيده الكريمة الزكية صلى عليه بارئ البرية. Now at 35, the Quraysh rebuilt the house, and there was a snake. When they decided to build it, there was this snake that used to come out every morning. It was a huge snake, and it hissed, and it scared. And they had superstition. They were superstitious, and they saw that as a sign from God that maybe this isn't a good idea to mess with God's house. And then one morning they went, and the snake came out, and it was hissing, and an eagle came down and just took it in its talons and flew off with it. And they said, Alhamdulillah, this is a sign that God's pleased with what we're doing. So they rebuilt the house, but they did not have enough money, because they made a condition that no money from a prostitute or from usury could be used to build the house. And so because of that, the donations, the fundraising didn't go as well as planned, and they were unable. So they built the qawa'id out, and that's what the shadarwan is. So when you make tawaf, that marble rukham that's there, that comes out, That's the original house. And that means that when you go up against the Kaaba, you're actually inside the Kaaba. So when you're up against the Kaaba, you're inside the Kaaba, because the wall of the Kaaba is actually at that Shadarwan where it comes out. So you go in, you're actually inside God's house. So anybody that goes up against the Kaaba is actually inside the house. You don't need to physically go in, although it's quite an extraordinary experience for those who have had it to go inside the house. But and also inside the Hijr of Ismail is in the house. You're inside the Kaaba. Now, and it's important for people should know this, but when you make tawaf, you shouldn't go in that shadarwan, because if you go in, you're not making tawaf. It actually breaks the shalt. So you have to stay away from that when you make. A lot of people don't know that, and they'll actually put their hand on the Kaaba as they're making tawaf. So that's an invalid tawaf. So when he did this, when they did this, the only thing that remained was the Hajar al-Aswad, to the cornerstone, to put it back in. And they started arguing, and they almost literally went to blows about this, because each clan thought, we should be able to do it. So Banu Makhzum said, no, it's ours to do. Abdul Dar said, no, it's ours to do. Each group was saying, it's our honor. So they said, what should we do? And they decided that they would judge the first person that came through would be the one that would decide for them. So they were waiting, and the Prophet ﷺ was the first one to walk in. And then they all said, Radina bil Amin. We're all content with the Al-Amin, because he was noted to be trustworthy. So the Prophet put the blanket out, put the stone on the blanket, had all of them pick up the stone, which is an amazing hikmah. The wisdom of the Prophet is obviously clearly manifested in this story. Picks up, and then they bring it up, and he is the one that placed the stone, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So then he says, مبعثه صلى الله عليه وسلم بيان مبعث النبي الهادي صلى عليه خالق العباد وجاءه جبريل في غار حراء من بعد 40 عاما غبرا في يوم الاثنين بسورة العلق صلى عليه الله فارق الفلق فقام يدعو الإنس والجن إلى توحيد رب العالمين مرسلا. The beginning of his mission is at 40. Now before, when in his late 30s, he began to see the ru'ya. Also, Shaykh gave me, I didn't bring it specifically for this, but because I had something written on the back. But Shaykh had one of his sons look up the thing about Abraham Lincoln, and he actually did have a dream 3 days before he was assassinated that he was going to be killed, assassinated at a theater, and one of his close friends actually, there were several witnesses him telling this dream. So the Shaykh used that example. He was surprised that neither I nor Dr. AbdulWahid knew our history as well as we should have. I said, Shaykh. So he began to have these dreams, and that's the beginning of the prophetic experience, is dreams, the ru'ya salihah. And he would have these dreams, they're very clear dreams. And then at 40, it was his wont to go up to the Jabal Nur, which is there, the Ghar Hira, the cave. And this is actually something that his ancestors did also. It wasn't just the Prophet ﷺ, but it was actually a retreat for his fathers. So it was a place where his fathers went also. For those of you who have been up there, it's quite a small cave. You can actually, historically, not anymore because of the buildings, but you could see the Kaaba from inside the cave. So in the books of Seerah, they say, وَكَانَ يَتَحَنَّثُ فِي غَارِ حِرَى, that he used to do tahannuth. Tahannuth in Arabic, al-hinth, which is in Surah Al-Waqi'ah, al-hinth al-azim, which is shirk. Tahannuth, tafa'ul, is one of the meanings of it is takalluf or tajannub, to avoid something. Like tahajjud is to avoid hujud, which is sleep. So tahannuth is to avoid hinth. So it was a place where he was able to go to empty out himself from the shirk that was around him. And he was doing, obviously, meditate, like what we would call meditation today. He was there to do his prayers. And during that period, at the age of 40, Jibreel alayhi salam comes to him. Now, when he comes, he's in Ramadan, he comes to him, and the first thing that Jibreel does is he squeezes him 3 times. He squeezes him حَتَّى بَلَغَ مِنْهُ الْجُهْدِ, until he thought that it was going to break his ribs. And he squeezes him 3 times, so hard that it was almost unbearable. And then, and some of the people of Ishara said that this was the last emptying out to prepare his it was like a spiritual emptying out. This is what they call in the mustarahat of the qawm, they call it the takhliya, which the 3 stages on a path to God are takhliya, tahliya, and tajliya, which is takhliya is the emptying out, tahliya is the adornment, so emptying out of everything other than Allah, and then adornment with the qualities that God, these qualities that God wants human beings to be adorned with, and then tajliya is where the meanings begin to be revealed to the person. So the Prophet ﷺ had this experience, and then iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq is the first. And some say Ya Ayyuhan Muzammil, Ya Ayyuhan Mudaththir. But the Alaq is the most famous one mentioned. So the Prophet ﷺ, at that point when he has this experience, he goes out. Now he saw Jibreel fill all the horizon. So you can imagine the shock. He was literally in shock. And he almost literally goes over the hill. It's quite steep up there if you've ever climbed up there. It took us a few hours to get up. It's quite a haul. And but he goes down, rushes down. He literally crawls into Aisha. He's shaking. So he's in trauma. I mean, any trauma physician knows when you read that story, because I worked in a trauma unit, when you read that story, he is in trauma. Now, one of the first things that you're supposed to do with a trauma person is you're supposed to wrap them up, because you need to bring the heat back into the body. And so what's so amazing to me about that story is that he is present enough, because when people are in trauma, they're completely absent. I mean, I saw a man die at Mina. He fell from the top. Where the jamarat were between, he was trying to cross over, and he fell down and landed right in front of us, Sudanese man. And I was with a physician, and he immediately got up, and we were telling him, sit down. And he said, no, I'm fine. Maybe a Shaykh. He said, I'm fine. We said, no, sit down. And then boom, he just dropped dead. So when people are in trauma, they don't know it. But he was present enough to say, Zammiluni, wrap me up. I mean, that is just such an amazing testimony to his state. Now, for those of you who have a Christian background, especially from Orthodox or Catholic tradition, which are the best ones, by the way. In Christianity, they have what's called the law of discernment. In the law of discernment it is the way in which you tell whether an experience is demonic by nature or angelic or divine, because people have spiritual experiences. In the law of discernment, in the Catholic and Orthodox tradition, the single most important thing is that initially, in a true religious experience of an angel, there is a very profound constriction of the soul that is followed by an expansion. In a demonic experience is exactly the opposite, that they have an expansion that's followed by a contraction. And that, the description of the Prophet is consistent with the law of discernment in the, you can Google this if you're interested in it, because it's important to note that, because by the Christian criterion for an angelic experience, our description of what happened to the Prophet ﷺ is consistent with their knowledge of whether or not we can discern this being a truly supernatural experience from the divine or a supernatural experience from the demonic realm. So he had this immense contraction, and he was worried. And this is according to the law of discernment, that is the concern, because truly spiritual people feel unworthy. Whereas somebody whose ego is still present, when they have an experience, they feel, yeah, exactly, this, of course. I'm such a special person. This. So they see it as, whereas he was worried this was a jinn or something that wasn't right. Now, what does Khadija say to him? This is amazing about her. One thing that she does is she takes off her headscarf. And then she asked, do you still see it? And he said, no. And then she puts her headscarf on, and then she could see it. That is also a proof, one, that she understood because the angels, when there's anything sexual out of adab, they move. And the unveiling of a woman is part of the sexual. This is, when people take off their clothes, when they disrobe to go to sleep or to be intimate. And so because of that, the angels left. And then she put it back and then came back. So that's another law of discernment. She's discerning what type of being is this. Is it a being that has modesty, or is it an immodest being? So she also, it's quite extraordinary, her knowledge of that. And then she says to the Prophet ﷺ, your Lord would never forsake you. Why? Because you help the needy, you feed the hungry, you take care of the orphans, you take care of the widows, you remove the burdens from people. All acts of social charity. It's just amazing. Like she sees, no, you're one of the good people. You're not one of the bad people. You're somebody out there. You're not an egocentric person. You are somebody that is living for other people, not for yourself. And those type of people, God does not forsake. That's what she's recognizing about the Prophet. So here's the woman telling her man, believe in yourself. Because I know who you are. You need to know who you are. Because he doesn't know yet. And then she says, for more confirmation, let's go to my cousin, Waraqa, because he knows about these things. We don't know about these things. So they go to Waraqa. When they get to Waraqa, he immediately recognizes it. And he says, this is the namus, which is from the Greek nomos, the logos, the law. The namus is the law, the sharia. It's the revelation of a rasul, not of a nabi. It's not wahi. The namus is what comes with the sharia. So the nomos, or the law. And he says this is what came to Moses. Now that's important also because Moses, if you look in the Old Testament, God says that he will send a prophet like unto Moses. And this is the last prophet who's like Moses. Now Jesus was not like Moses. Jesus was not in a leadership position. He did not bring a new sharia. He said, I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to confirm the law. Whereas the Prophet ﷺ came with a new sharia. So this is what was happening at this point in the Prophet ﷺ's and he arose, فَقَامَ يَدْعُ الْإِنسَ وَالْجِنَّ إِلَى تَوْحِيدِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ مُرْسَلًا. So he began to call people to tawheed. مُؤَيَّدًا مِنْهُ بِمَا أَعْيَى الْبَشَرِ. He was supported by God with miracles. إِحْصَاؤُهُ مِنْ مُعْجِزَاتٍ كَالْمَطَرِ. That it's impossible to to really enumerate them. They were like rain, كالمطر نفعا وكثرة وكالسراج نورا ورفعة مع ابتهاج. They were like the sun in its brilliance and height coupled with radiant beauty. ومع ذا حاصره الفجار كما أتت بذلك الأخبار. Despite all of that, the evildoers laid down sanctions against him, as the sound historical accounts have informed us. وَكَانَ قَادِرًا عَلَى التَّدْمِيرِ لَوْ شَاءَ لَكِنْ جَادَ بِالتَّأْخِيرِ. He was capable of wreaking havoc upon them had he wished. Instead, he generously gave them respite. So the Prophet ﷺ, when he came with this message, he was given all of these proofs. It was very clear. Despite that, Quraysh were very upset. They'd seen him grow up amongst them. They'd seen him as a child. He was from a poor family. Before that, he was not particularly distinguished amongst them other than for his honesty. He wasn't eloquent. He did not give speeches. He wasn't a poet. He wasn't wealthy. His money actually came from marriage. He married into wealth. So for all intents and purposes, they did not see him as somebody likely to be of any significance amongst them. And so it was quite troubling to them when he began to call them to the Tawheed. And then there are many stories. You have Dr. Ling's book. I would love to go into them because they are amazing, but because we have so much material to get through, I think I'm going to just stick to the text from now on because it's going to take us a while to get through this. And this is a really wonderful text for people to learn. If I have time, I'm going to try to actually put the English into a verse form, put it into a metered form so the kids can memorize it and things. Are there any questions about anything? Muna?
I have a question about Sayyidah. You said that she was married twice before the
Yeah.
once a widow, and the second marriage, what was it?
It just didn't work out. Yeah, she divorced.
Because I thought she was widowed twice.
You know, there might be khilaf about that, but because there are khilaf about a lot of that before the Ba'atha, even after. What's that? He didn't really say he was a prophet. He just told him, that this man has he has a divine, I mean, in essence, he did tell him that. But the Prophet ﷺ, I don't think he was aware at that time. There's no indication that he was aware at that time.
If the Jews of Palestine were going to recognize him as a genuine prophet, why would they go against him?
Well, no, because some of them did not. They knew that there was somebody coming that would remove their position because they had a special status. And the Prophet ﷺ he's the Nabi al-Ummiyin. He's the Abrahamic prophet that universalizes the covenant. Because they rejected Jesus, and the followers of Jesus go out and universalize the covenant with Gentiles. But they never accepted that. So they never accepted Jesus. And they didn't accept the Prophet ﷺ because he wasn't a Jew. I mean, that's very clear. And the Jews that accepted him actually talk about that and mention that there was envy and that they did not accept him for that reason. So even what's interesting is some of the Jews accepted him. And the dominant opinion, you can read in Kohler's book, who was a rabbi in Boston. He wrote a book called Jewish Theology, and he has a chapter on Islam. And he says in there that Islam is actually a divinely ordained religion. And he said that is the opinion of the medieval rabbis. But they believed that the Prophet was a fulfillment a verse in Zechariah where the waters of the Torah would flow unto the Gentiles. And some of the Jewish rabbis saw the prophet as a precursor to the Messiah, that he was preparing the world for Tawheed, for monotheism. And they also considered, to a certain degree, the Christians doing that, but they did not consider them to be, they only said to the degree with which they take their religion from Judaism. But they reject the Trinity. The Jews have the same attitude towards the Trinity that the Muslims do. I mean, they believe that it's anathema and that it's against. So they don't consider them to be teaching monotheism correctly. Whereas the Jews believe that we are Noahidic people. The Muslims are Noahides, which is, it's nice because in Judaism, they believe that Muslims are saved. They don't believe Muslims are pagans or idolaters, because we're following the Noahidic laws. The Noahidic laws are 7 out of the 10 commandments, and we follow those. And so they believe that we're in a sound tradition. But they say that he's Nabi al-Ummiyin, he's not a Jewish prophet. And that is why in our books of Aqidah, that's mentioned specifically that they're still kafir if they say he's a prophet but not to us. Because that is the position of some of the Jews, that the Prophet ﷺ is a prophet, but not to the Jews. And then many Jews became Muslim historically, and they still become Muslim, which is why it's important to recognize that oftentimes in our books, it makes blanket statements about the Jews. You have to be very careful, because the Arabs, first of all, have a rhetorical device, which they call itlaq al-kull al-ba'd, to use a universal for a particular, to use, to say everybody when you mean somebody. Like in the Quran, it says, قَالَتِ الْيَهُودُ يَدُ اللَّهِ مَغْلُولَةٌ غُلَّتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ. The Jews say that God's hand is bound. May God bound their hands. If you read in the Tafsir, Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi said, the Jews don't say that. Only one Jew said that. When the Prophet was asking for money, one of the Jews in Medina said, "Oh, is God's hand bound?" He was making fun. To a devout Jew, that's blasphemy to say that. So, unfortunately, a lot of Muslims, Arabs read these things and they think, oh, that's just the Jews. No, they're devout Jews. They have the same types of laws that we have about talking about God and things like that. So, it's important not to. You just have to be careful reading this literature, the pre-modern literature.
Do we know what prayers the Prophet used to do in Al-Qur'an?
I've tried to look for it. There's no real descriptions of what he was doing up there. But the Hunafa definitely had practices that they did. Mm-hmm. Well, we don't have a doctrine of original sin in the Christian sense of the word, but we do have an understanding that there is a seed in the heart of man that's black. The Prophet ﷺ said every human being has a black dot in their heart that is open to evil. And to the degree with which people engage in evil, that it grows. It's like a seed. And so it grows until the entire heart becomes black. So we do believe that there is an original spot of sin potential. We just don't believe that we inherited the sin of anybody. لَا تَزِرُ وَازِرَةٌ وِزْرَ أُخْرَى. No soul bears the sin of a previous soul. So we don't bear this. And we also believe Adam was given Tawbah. God forgave his sins. But we do believe that sins are visited upon people from their ancestors, that the effects of sin are visited upon people, which is not to say those people are responsible, but they get the results of the sin. Just like if your father, not your father, but somebody's father, was a thief of great notoriety, well, you're just stuck with that. I mean, you can go change your name and hide everything, but people inherit that's why if you're from a good family, it's a great blessing. and you should be even more grateful to your parents if they're good people. But if you come from a family that has bad people, you get affected by that. And in the same way, people are affected by the sins of their ancestors. There's no doubt about that. So people in the back, go ahead.
Given the Quraysh tribe leaders believed in the idols, what was the importance of Hajar in that respect?
Well, the Hajar was a stone that came from heaven. It was, Allahu A'lam, it's maybe a meteorite, but I mean, it is a meteorite. I mean, they've analyzed it, and it's not from the earth. And according to the narration, it came down to the Jabal Abi Qubays, which is where the king's palace is now. And it had a light that spread out, and that light is where the hudud of the haram, where that light reached is where the haram's hudud are, according to one narration. So it was put into the house when Ibrahim a.s. built the house. He put the stone in the house. And according to the hadith, that the sins of people took the light out, so it became black from the sins of people. The stone, I mean, it's a good point, because the Arabs were worshipping stones, and that's why Omar went past the stone and he said, Wallahi inni a'lamu annaka la tadurru wa la tanfa'. I know you don't harm or benefit. And had I not seen the Prophet kiss you, I would have not kissed you. So he was letting people know. Now, Ali, when he heard that, he said, Bal yadurru wa yanfa'. No, it harms and it benefits. So each is speaking from a different tongue. Omar speaking from the tongue of haqiqah, which is the reality. Nothing in the world can harm or benefit. Sayyidina Ali is speaking from the tongue of sharia, that the asbab harm and benefit. So you have to be aware of that. So you respect the asbab. You don't drink poison. You show deference to people in power, people of authority, things like that for that reason. So, but the stone is also in the hadith that Imam Ahmad relates, Yaminullah fil ard. It's the right hand of God on the earth. And it was the sunnah of the ancient people to kiss the hand of God. And so God gave that stone for humans as a metaphorical kissing the hand of God. So it's like going to God's house, visiting God, and then the stone is symbolic of the hand of God. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of miracles on the hijrah. We're going to get to the hijrah, but there were a lot of miracles. Mm-hmm.
Regarding Waraka, I've read different riwayas on how long he lived after that and whether or not he was being Muslim.
He's definitely a Muslim, and the Prophet ﷺ said, do not speak ill of him. He believed in the Prophet ﷺ. He died shortly thereafter, which makes sense because the Prophet ﷺ, because he had knowledge of the previous dispensations, that could have been used as some of the Quraysh said that a Persian was teaching the Prophet all of these stories. So, but he did die shortly thereafter. And he said he wished he could be with him when his people chased him out. And he said, are my people going to chase me out? He said, no prophet has come with this except his people chased him out. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam.
He said that in the there are 3 steps:
Takhliya, tahliya, and tajliya.
So did the Prophet have this 3 steps specifically, or did he have the journey from the beginning?
No, he definitely had, like the splitting of the chest is a takhliya, the squeezing is a takhliya, the tribulations he had, all those things are part of that process. I mean, it's just for him, it's different from other people because he did not have the same types of ru'unat and nafs You know, he didn't have the lower kind of bestial impulses that other people have. His heart was always very high. But the Qawm says hasanat al-abrar sayyat al-muqarrabin, and that's true. That the good actions of righteous people are the bad actions of people in divine presence. Because everything's a maqam. There's people that give charity and it's a good deed, but the nafs still has a halv. Because the portion of, to the degree with which the ego has a portion in the act is, there's naqs, khidaj in the act. And so the purer the act, the closer it is to God. So the people that are closest to God, their acts are the purest. And that's why when they increase in their knowledge and awareness of God, they actually say astaghfirullah for their good deeds. And that's why Abasa wa Tawalla is such an important verse, because the Prophet was in a good deed, but there was a better deed to be done at the same time. And he was doing the good deed, neglecting the better deed. That's the wrong actions of the righteous, of the people. It's their priority of good deed. It's not the deeds themselves. So Allah rebuked him for not getting the priority right. He was more interested in getting the help of the wealthy who weren't really that interested in the message than delivering the message to the poor that wanted to hear the message. And Allah was telling him, no, these people are more important.
Is there a place where the seer is there from his perspective, saying that this event is the khati, this event is the jannah,
You'll see that you read that in some of the Seerah al-Halabiyya. He goes into some pretty amazing spiritual insights into what's going on. I'll give you an example of the raising of the maqamat of the Prophet ﷺ that Ibn Abi Jamrah mentions. Ibn Abi Jamrah says at the beginning of the message, he's going to Gar Hira to get away from all the distractions. At the end of the message, he's praying with his beautiful 18-year-old wife on the bed in front of him, and when he goes into sajda, he hits her legs so that she can pull them up. He said he's in a complete state of presence to where even there's just no distraction. So that's an example that Ibn Abi Jamrah mentions about that. Of taking off the headscarf? No, you can't. In your house, you're completely, you're completely, it's out of adab. It's just out of adab to you. That they're creatures of adab, which is why the angels, when a man and a wife are intimate, the angels, it's all out of adab, that's all. It's not that they're not present. They're present. They remove themselves from that. It's out of adab. The same with naked. The Prophet ﷺ said, don't walk in your houses naked, because there's creatures in your house there that you should be aware and have adab with them also. That doesn't mean you don't take a shower and do, you have to do what you have to do. It's just being aware that there are unseen creatures. It was first built by the angels. There's a lot. The Bayt al-Ma'mur is in the heavens, and the Bayt al-Ma'mur is connected to the earth through the Kaaba. So there's a connection between the heavens and the earth. That's why it's such an amazing place to be at, because it is the direct connection. It's like a wormhole in quantum mechanics. It's one of those amazing places where the dua whoosh, just goes straight up. Adam then built the Kaaba, and then it's over time. It was destroyed, and then it was rebuilt by Ibrahim and Ismail. Did somebody over there? The message of Tawheed, the Aqidah, is the same. The Sharia changes. So the Aqidah is always the same. They teach about Ba'ath, they teach about the Yawm al-Qiyamah, they teach the oneness of God, they teach about the prophets, about revelation. You know, the 6 things that we believe in, they all teach those basic things. Iman billah, wal yawm al-akhir, wal kutub, wal malaika, wal qadr khayrihi, wal sharrihi, wal ba'ath. Those things they teach. But Sharia differs. There are many things in the previous Shari'as that have been removed from us. So we can eat things they couldn't eat. We can do things they couldn't do.
You mentioned about Yehud and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaking about them in the Quran. There's some ahadith where the Sahaba express dislike of the Yehud. How do we interpret those narrations?
Well, I think, they're there. There was a lot of animosity. There's no doubt about that. You just have to be careful because the Prophet Rifa'a, Samaw'al, the Prophet Mukhayriq, he spoke well of some of the Jews that were there that were honorable in their transactions with him. Min Ahlul Kitab, Ummatun Qa'imatun, Yutruna Ayatillah. There's from the people of the book, Laysu Sawa. They're not all the same. The people of the book, amongst them are people that recite the signs of God. Some of them interpret that to mean the Ahlul Kitab that became Muslim, and others say no. It means that amongst them are people يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. And we know that. For people that live in the West, we know there's good people that do read their Bible and they do acts of charity and they condemn vice that they see. I mean, I think anybody that lives in the West knows that there's good people amongst them that do all those things that the Quran describes. The Quran also says, minhum al-mu'minun, amongst them are believers, wa aktharuhum al-fasiqun, but most of them have gone outside and transgressed the limits that were set down for them. Lastu ma'ala shay hatta tuqima at-Tawrat wal-Injil. You don't have anything until you apply the Torah and the Injil. So very few people, Kierkegaard a few hundred years ago complained that the problem with Christianity is that there was only one Christian in all of Christendom, and that was Jesus. So it's a hard religion to follow, Christianity. But the Jews are, they're a mixed bag like anybody. But they have certain things that are problematic, there's no doubt. They were given a lot of prophets. If you look at Israel today, much of Israel is atheistic by their own statistics. They do a lot of social science, and you can look it up. So there are many Jews that are very irreverent, just the way they speak about religion. And Jewish comedy in the West introduced religious irreverence. There's no doubt about that. So, but do we make a blanket statement about all Jews? No, it's a dangerous thing to do. And in the same way we don't want that done to us, we should not do that to other people, because it's not recognizing that all people have good and bad people. The degrees to which they're good or bad, that's would be impossible to determine unless you were God. So, yeah, some people might have more bad people than good people and vice versa, but that's a very hard thing. It's impossible to determine. So it's just better to look at people as mixed bags. That, Shakespeare says we're a commingling of good and evil, which is very true. And the Prophet ﷺ said that, that shaitan, inna shaitan yajri fi ibni adam majari ad-dam, that shaitan, evil flows in the blood of every man. I mean, that's, whether it's neuropeptides or whatever that he's talking about, Allahu Alam. But there's definitely, all of us are struggling with ourselves, and some people that struggle, the darkness is more than the light, and vice versa. So, Well, no, good is good. So anything that you do that's good, even if the ego is involved in it, it's better than doing something than nothing or than bad. There's no doubt about that. And, Qadi Abu Bakr said that ikhlas is so precious that even if you're sincere for a moment in your life, it'll be enough for you. وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ. They were only commanded to worship God with ikhlas. Qadi Abu Bakr says, وَقَفَتَ السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضِ بِتِلْكِ الْآيَةِ. The heavens and the earth were stood up when they heard that ayah, knowing how difficult that is. So, yeah. Last question, because I actually have to go. You already, go ahead.
Can you just elaborate on, you mentioned that when you touch the Kaaba, it invalidates your salah. Is that the case for the black stone as well?
No. Blackstone and Rukn al-Yamani don't go in that. But that marble around the Hijr Ismail does, so you shouldn't touch that either. But the black stone don't, or the Rukn al-Yamani, neither of them invalidate, because the Prophet touched the both of them. Alhamdulillah, Jazakumullah khair. Inshallah, about Medina, I would do, it's good to do prayer on the Prophet ﷺ on your way to Medina, and remember, the Haram, you're not in Kansas anymore. It's like you're in the Haram, and they're big places to be, and the longer you're in them, the more forgetful you get. Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayya won't spend more than a few hours in either Mecca or Medina. He just won't. He comes in and he leaves. And I know a lot of the ulama are like that, because the more you know, the scarier it gets. The adab of those places is immense. So just try to be in the best state, be in a state of dhikr. Don't do ghiba. All those things are much worse in the haram. They are. They're bad wherever you are, but they're really bad in the haram. Please be very, very just respectful towards the people that are here.